Srinivas and Harsha, very quickly introducing the two of you to the rest of the world. Harsha, did you say something?
No, I didn't say anything, but I can go first since I'm talking anyways.
Yes, you can
Hi,
go
my name
first,
is.
but basically, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Go on.
Hi, my name is Harsha. I'm a product manager with a startup in Gurgaon called Blue Sky Analytics, which is currently figuring out how to build environmental data sets using satellite imagery. But prior to that, I was a journalist with Mint. I was a data journalist there, and for about 2.5, 3 years, I worked on all sorts of data relating to India. And before that, I was with the Hyderabad Urban Lab for about 3 years, where I did a lot of cool mapping stuff relating to Hyderabad.
Okay, so following on that, Srinivas, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Srinivas Kodali. I've been associated with various data movements in this country. I actively track politics of data and evolutions of digitization in this country. Currently, a volunteer with the Free Software Movement of India, where I am trying to build alternative economic digital solutions that are potentially that can potentially offer a way out to this very privacy invasive stuff that the government of India is building.
Okay, so Srinivas and Harsha, we are presenting the two of you to the world under the title One Byte at a Time and One Pixel at a Time. If you haven't already guessed the reason is very simple. In the last 8 months, everybody's lives have been very, very seriously slowed down. It's almost like you're on a pause. Lives have been put on hold. And what we wanted to hear, because you have been regulars at Dodin all these years, is to hear from the two of you what it was like for the last 8 months. What did you people do as data people? What did you do as two young men confined to your homes, which doesn't seem to be a very natural thing for either of you. So please tell us what you've been up to bit by bit.
I can go first. So
Yes.
so in March, when the pandemic truly hit us, like at least in terms of talking points, I was still employed with Mint, and one of the first things we did, like any other standard media outlet, was to constantly look at the number of cases that are growing across the country, do the standard thing. ये स्टेट में इतने केसेस है, ये सिटी में इतने केसेस है, पिछले हफ्ते से इतने केसेस बढ़ गए. We build like a COVID tracker, and like a lot of things in India, once you keep repeating on something regularly, people lose interest. People no longer care. 3 lakh COVID deaths, nothing. Like, so we're just like, they're just numbers. In a country with 140 crore people, this is nothing. And we were worried about that desensitization of the pandemic through bombarding of regular data. And so we were also figuring out what other ways can we talk about the impact of the pandemic. And one of the things that this one private firm in Delhi was interested was to be able to track down COVID cases within a city at a city level. The idea was that you find like where within a certain city, like for example, I'm from Delhi. So where in Delhi are COVID cases increasing? The data is being captured right now at a district level at max. And even at a municipal level, the ward level data is not out. So if the city were to tackle the spread of the pandemic, it needed to have information on where these cases were happening. However, if anybody is familiar with working on Indian cities, getting anything like ward shapefiles itself is like a really hard task. Getting anything more finer than that is next to impossible. And so, there was this standard challenge that Indian cities do not have, neighborhood maps to just be able to start tracking things on where cases were going. That's something as simple as that. Moving on to something more complex, one of the other things that we were interested was, as the business newspapers, how is the economy being impacted? the word economy is like a pretty huge word, but one of the things we were interested was unemployment. My editor and I worked on a story on what are the two different kinds of measures of unemployment. For example, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, the PLFS is this survey that's run by the National Statistics Organization. That's one measure of measuring it. And then there's a private firm called CMI, which also measures unemployment. And we were interested in how are these questions being asked to arrive at a number that is an unemployment number. And I can give you the link to the story. It's on the chat. The idea was, if we are tracking data, what are the questions we are asking, and how does how does changing of asking the questions change the numbers that we are looking at? uh, because as you say, the questions you ask gives you the data you want. And the interesting thing is the PLFS survey has been a standard for a while. It's been vetted by a lot of international organizations. However, the PLFS survey comes with a lag. It never comes like right away. Whereas the CMI survey comes with a like 2 weeks ago. So since it comes more regularly, the CMI numbers get a lot more traction on everywhere. So we were curious on trying to find out if the CMI data is close to the PLFS data. And turns out they're just asking very different questions, but it's all being aggregated and presented as an unemployment rate. So that was also one thing we were dealing with in terms of how do you measure things in this country, especially knowing that measuring things is already pretty hard. And there are people who are trying to figure a way of counting it, but not many people are thinking about what are the questions that are being asked, how is the nature of the questions itself affecting the number. That discourse does not exist a lot in India. In fact, this piece that we wrote, the only person who cared enough was the CEO of CMI, Mahesh Vyas, who was just like, dude, we are two different surveys. But aside from that, one one other thing we were also interested, this is one other way we were trying to track the impact of the pandemic. Since But my other colleagues in the newspaper were more interested in covering the personal stories of the migrants moving away from the big cities back to the states that they work in. And that is where like it is a true tragedy that we've not been able to capture or visualize that in any form of number. Like, one possible data set that I thought in my head was, if we could get these trains that the railway ministry were running from cities back to the states, and we could get an idea of the number of people who are getting on those trains, we could maybe see like a visual of people migrating from these large cities back into the hinterland. But like a lot of things with this current government, it's pretty hard to get data. I believe they said that they do not have any data on migrants at all, which begs the question. Uh, in a country like India that's rapidly, seeing a fair amount of influx of people from the rural areas to cities to work, how do we track migrants in a way that it's possible for us to cater to them? Right now, I do not think our cities are built. I think migrants come at the lowest tier of importance to a lot of people, especially those in power, because migrants don't necessarily have voting rights in a lot of cases. So maybe they're excluded from the conversation altogether. Unless, like, let's say in Delhi, Bihari migrants have been coming for a while now. So now the chief minister is doing Chhat Puja on like whenever it is Chhat Puja. Um, but that's not the case, and this is a process that's happened over a really long while. Whereas more migrants who come into these cities, especially in the south, in the last couple of years, at least in Hyderabad, I know this is the case, that like 7 years or 8 years ago, you would not see a lot of Biharis in Hyderabad. The only Biharis were largely working as attendants in public toilets. But right now, you see an influx of Bihari men primarily who are working as staff in the city. You go to a South Indian restaurant, like you go to Chutneys on Banjara Hills, and you're talking, and the waiter does not speak Telugu, and it's a little jarring, but it's also a representation. I mean, this is anecdata, but it's also a representation that if there are people coming into the cities, how do we make our cities cater to them, given the nature of being a migrant? And I don't think there are many organizations that are thinking about it or tracking about it. Uh, one thing we did at the Hyderabad Urban Lab that comes to my mind is A few years ago, ActionAid had asked us to identify laborer. They were interested in finding out where do workers go and get jobs. A laborer does like a very informal market that workers, primarily informal workers who are seeking to fix your houses, paint, etc. They go and aggregate outside a chaurasta, and people go and solicit them for work. So we helped ActionAid map about 150 of these laborer across Hyderabad. That eventually became the cornerstone of the GHMC 5 rupee canteens that were set up. And one of the unintended consequences of those canteens being set up was during the migrant crisis, they were a point of contact for a lot of the migrants to get access to food. Uh, and this is something that has happened due to a completely unrelated thing. But I think it provides a good potential into thinking about how do we funnel existing, how do we think about our cities in ways that they can provide for everybody? Like, how do we make sure that anybody who does not have a home, anybody who's an outsider, how do they have access to basic things like shelter, food, or water? And I would think the future for gathering any kind of data would be to think hyper local. Like, if you're around you, what can you do that can maybe make lives of people slightly better? And with that, I conclude.
Okay, Harsha had a long time, I guess, exploring data during the pandemic. I did not do all
Very
of
long.
this. Yeah,
I got paid for it, so I had that.
got paid for it. Uh, so, uh, so on the issue of how I spent through my lockdown, I was mostly home, frankly. Uh, we were not really sure how long we could venture out. You all went through the same, obviously. But there are these interesting digital solutions that popped up, which were restricting your move or even supporting you to stay home, right? Like the first and important thing that happened with the lockdown is essentially how people stopped moving entirely and how everybody started moving online. If I have to compare it from a traditional traffic movement on a road, okay, I have a background in civil engineering, so I was studying urban cities before I did all of my tech work. So I'm probably not comparing both an offline city and an online city in the internet and cyberspace in the right way, but uh, please indulge me. So, what we essentially witnessed is the traffic online just spiked. The broadband companies, your ISPs, which are required to supply you with internet, were unable to match the demand. Everybody was like live streaming movies most of the time, and they're like, no, we can't handle your bandwidths. Anyway, so this is a really interesting thing to look at, but all of this stopping of traffic movement had its own advantages. Say small gests were like, this is the first time earth has been so silent that we can hear uh, noises from earth movements very clearly, right? Like there, it was good and bad in its own way, that it eventually helped you realize that human activity on earth, especially cities, has been so noisy, and all that noise has to go somewhere, and it just went online. It came into the cyberspace. Cybercrime increased. I don't know how many of you actually noticed this, but uh, as the economic activity moved away from cities to the cyberspace, so did crime. Now, the there were obviously phishing calls. There were like people who would like just call me up saying, "Oh, we need help to help with Zoom," right? Like people were so afraid of joining Zoom because there were reports of Zoom having privacy issues, of Zoom having servers in China. And like people were just afraid of this transition from an offline economic activity into the cyberspace, and everybody was forced into it. Like whether you were a 6 year old kid who was attending your kindergarten or potentially pre primary schools, you were being forced in front of a laptop and you were asked to like attend the classes. uh, Whether we liked it or not, digitization has been forced on us. And I don't know how people navigated it, frankly, but there were all fanatic calls across the globe, lots of questions, and I did spend quite a bit of time explaining this. How does the cyberspace essentially work? It's not, the rules of a city don't apply to cyberspace anymore. And yeah, it's been like a interesting time, but it's an economic opportunity at the same time for most of these companies, right? Like you have Zoom, which was a small company which nobody knew, suddenly becoming like one of the big techs, and now they want to enter email services and potentially compete with Google. So the way economic activities in cities has been taking place has entirely transformed, and this provided an opportunity for a lot of Indian IT companies, frankly, to push people to digitization. And one of the consequences of this was also that the government has been pushing us to install apps, right? Like Arogya Setu, like everybody has been forced to install it. Like now, the major worry with the app has always been, does it track your location? A constant question with no actual reply from the government. How was the government using your call data records for disease surveillance? I mean, pretty much every other state government, or rather the police, was surveilling everyone to understand how people were moving. I mean, people were so data hungry to understand uh, how humans actually moved, because they couldn't really anticipate how this virus was spreading, right? Like, uh, but do we as individuals, as traffic engineers or as urban geographers, really understand how people move actually? I mean, even pre-COVID, during lockdown, post-lockdown, uh, it's, you really can't predict it, and everybody just wanted to acquire a lot of data about humans. And that's happening, whether we accept it or not. At this point of time, I've realized we can't like really oppose digitization. uh, the concerns with digitizations are valid. When you look at the issues of surveillance and privacy, clearly the data protection law that India was supposed to get at least 3 years ago is still in the pipeline. And so a lot of these conversations was something that I was occupied with. And frankly, now I started to see the cyberspace as its own geography, where you have communities which are grouping through, like us over this Zoom call. And we need to probably start looking into cyberspace as a city in itself, where we need to understand how and what people are doing, what's happening, how uh, are people being, uh, is cyberspace essentially helping people or it's harming them? And it's obviously a mix of both. It's not like, it's not, it's a new age actually, frankly, for a lot of people. Post COVID is a new world that we haven't lived through. And how we're going to navigate it in particular is something that will be really concerned and at the same time interesting to look at. But I have few things to caution about, that the government, which is essentially required to help us, help the individuals and people navigate through this, is not doing its job in its right way. And in fact, they want to push this digitization efforts so that it generates newer economic opportunities for them. But in doing so, they're completely ignoring the issues. Okay, I'll end it there. Uh, I don't know if I uh, explained things well, but I wanted to summarize what was happening with this whole digitization efforts in India.
Great. Srinivas and Harsha, I have a bit of a challenge for both of you. Um, Given that we have another 15 minutes, each of you gets to ask the other one question. And I'm sure Harsha will jump in and say, I'll go first. But Srinivas,
I was going to say
feel
that
free
I
to
don't
push him
have
out.
questions. I was saying I don't have questions. No
You
questions and
do
no
have.
comments. No, I think it is a little, I mean, I think I mean, bear with me. I think I've not fully been able to properly think through on the
Hmm.
impact of lockdown on, like, I mean, this is like a once in a lifetime sort of change, but this is like something that we're still going through and processing. So I've not had the time to fully think about it in a way that can meaningfully contribute.
Mm-hmm.
I once said this in school and I got an F for not submitting my homework. Hoping it'll work today.
No, okay. So let me put this in another way. Both Harsha and Srinivas, the thing that I'm trying to get at is basically this. This has been an extremely confusing and difficult time for all of us. I don't think that any of us can ever claim that we have understood this fully. In some ways, one of my friends put this very beautifully, actually citing um, from um, mm, one of the post-colonial writers, that understanding the contemporary moment is literally like watching a movie with your cheek to the screen. And the title of this actually came from that conversation. That when you have your cheek pressed to the screen, you can only see one pixel at a time. You move around, you'll still see only one pixel. So the only way you can actually make sense of what is going on in the contemporary moment is by having conversations with each other, right? So if you've noticed and if you have attended any of the earlier sessions, essentially what we are asking all of us, including ourselves, is what does this current moment mean to us? Not because we think that we can have clear, well articulated answers. We don't, obviously we don't. But we ask each other, so what do you think? So that it begins to make sense. So since you are waiting, so Vanshika, are you saying that we have a question from Gautam? Vanshika, do you want to intervene?
I'm just checking. I'm not seeing a question yet.
Vanshika?
I have a question then. I mean, to anyone.
I
Uh,
don't see a question yet, sir.
Okay. All right. So, Srinivas, you were saying something?
yeah, so I was saying I have a question. I mean, this is something obvious that I've been thinking to as well. So, in this whole push for digitization, I mean, when we were building cities, we built streets, we built houses, building infrastructure, right? Like you were essentially building it a layer on layer over years, like Hyderabad has been built over 500 years. We went through our own set of progress periods, post liberalization being one. You built highways, you built flyovers. Now, within the digital space, within the cyberspace, people are building these infrastructures. Like India is building all these stacks on top of Aadhaar. You're going to get the new health stack that's going to come up for next year. Uh, how should we view this infrastructure development when, if and when, how we have to compare it with the traditional development of a city? I mean, as a lot of you have been studying evolution of cities and people, and how do you essentially look at cyberspace and the newer infrastructure that's coming on cyberspace and all these new people joining it, except it's not really visible to the naked eye. It's out of thin air that all of these systems are popping up. uh, how do you view this evolution or transition This is a very, how do I put it? It's a very abstract question that I have. I'm looking at a macro point rather than a micro scale. So yeah, open to anyone who has any opinion on this.
Mm-hmm. Vanshika, do you want to take that question? You
No,
have a
actually,
response?
I was just trying to think through, the thread between the previous session and this, because we briefly did touch upon access, and we were talking about, how the cracks with the digital medium have become even more visible, with teaching having gone online, and the entire sort of, a system that is revealing itself as cracked. When that is taking place, it did reveal its cracks even before. It's just that we're seeing them more forcefully, perhaps. And I was just wondering that, at the response that was once given in this year, that, we do not have data, for, say, our migrants, or even say, there was once a time where, recording COVID deaths uh, appeared to be a data problem as well, as to how do you count. We've seen the problem about measuring things, as a continuous refrain throughout the year, in different points in time, in different situations, starting with Delhi in February, then say with the migrants during the lockdown, then about the healthcare workers. And while I do understand that technical acumen is something that is worth respecting, and is something that needs to be taken very carefully if we are to do those exercises, this is a question that is also a question about political will. And as practitioners in the world of data, how do you see the future where this collaborative will is, well, not being seen as it should be, and yet there is a possibility of doing excellent work with respect to data and finding ways to generate new ways of data?
Vanshika is very smart. She threw the question back at Srinivas
Yeah.
Kodali.
But
Yeah,
Harsha, do you
because
want to
I
go
think
first?
we
No,
should
no,
No,
it's
but
an
also.
important
Srinivas,
one.
Oh no, I was the one who threw the question first.
Okay. So
Also, sorry, before we go in, I think it'll be good to engage with the audience who've made time to,
yeah.
be here with us in this session. So even if there's not a question, but if it's just a mere reflection that you wish to share, please raise your hand, write to us at the chat room. It'll be useful to just know your reflections, even if they're at a very formative state at this point in time, because it's just an opening of a conversation and doesn't really have to be, closures here.
okay, so it's been 25 years that internet arrived in India. Okay, August 15th, 1995 is the year when VSNL launched its internet services. So the reason I mention it is, in this 25 years, a lot has happened. People who were the early inhabitants of the internet, which is like mostly academics, nerds, geeks, all of them. Like, you have all these subculture people have made it their own, and they've always protected it. They've always contributed to it. The projects from, like, open access projects for education, like Sci-Hub and LibGen, are a great example of this culture, right? Like, so when we're talking about creating data, looking at ways to imagine how this transition in terms of access, or trying to understand these things, and especially from a political will point of view, I think the political will right now is purely economical. That they're really interested in digitization because it generates new economic opportunities, and because it actually quantifies everything. It quantifies work, it quantifies profit. It is really great for the government to have documented records. So Data is being generated. The question is who has access to it. Is there a political will to share this data rather? So I would look at it that way. And from that point of time, yes, there is a political will to share data, but then to who? Uh, the government badly wants to share our data to private companies who can use it to build a data economy. Uh, but at the same time, is the government really interested to share any of this data to the public? I would say no. In fact, there's been a question within the whole information policy circle is like who gets to access government APIs, right? You have Aadhaar, you have UPI, a lot of this infrastructure that's coming up. And the way people can access this, private companies can access it is through application programming interfaces, APIs. Google Maps has one to simplify it further. So access through these APIs essentially means access to data, access to economic opportunities. You have companies like Uber and Ola, which can build on top of Google Maps and provide services. Or you have researchers like Hyderabad Urban Lab, who's using this data to understand Hyderabad. But the government has this policy on implementation guidelines for open API. There's an actual policy that has come up around February 2020. And it has no mention for individual access. You have to be a private company. You have to justify why you need access to this APIs, to this infrastructure essentially. So yeah, so in some sense, the political will exists, but it's purely from an economic point of view. There is no political will from a social point of view to trying to understand this problem or to try to help solve some of these issues at large. And that reflects in government's answers to the recent parliament parliament session, where they said we have no data. So in their political will to supply data back to the people, their answer is we don't have any data. But when it comes to collecting data, they have all the data they need. Okay, I'll end it there.
Thanks, Srinivas. Is an answer here? Do we have any other questions from other people who've joined us? Okay. Any closing comments from Harsha and Srinivas? Would you like to give your closing comments now?
Srinivas, do you want to go first? Okay. I would think that in terms of closing comments, like Srinivas said, I think we should all be vigilant and keep an eye out for things that are slowly changing around us or things that are subtly imposed upon us. We must be a little critical, not because we are currently opposing the government that is in power. We should do this no matter whoever is in power. We should constantly keep an eye out for what are ways data can be misused. I mean, the word data is thrown around as if it's like, it's like something meaningless, but there are people's lives at stake. There's so much that can go wrong. And in India, so much will go wrong. I mean, Srinivas is the right person to tell you of how terrible things can be due to badly built data sets. And as a result, I would think it's important that if you are thinking about collecting a data, or if you know someone's collecting something, or if you notice something that's happening in your neighborhood, question it, identify why it's happening, figure out if they have to really collect data to do this. Like, it's not necessary to collect data for everything. Like, why is Arogya Setu a thing? Like it's a sham right now. They use Arogya Setu to check if you enter into a mall. I install the damn app at the mall and like I can say, listen, I'm safe. I mean, why does Arogya Setu need to know where I am if I'm going to a mall, especially if I've installed it at the mall? It's not serving its purpose of measuring if I'm truly COVID negative. In fact, it's just collecting additional data from me. And in countries like India, there is a tendency to, how do I say it? बड़े साहब ने कहा है ये करो. We have ऊपर से order आए आपको आरोग्य सेतु के बिना अंदर नहीं आ सकते हो. Like there's very little opposition to it, and I mean Indians love following rules, which is great. But I would think we should have a healthy opposition to things that are thrust upon us like this.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Harsha.
Okay, so my closing comments are essentially this. We want to become a digital republic, and this desire rather, to become a digital republic has been there forever. We would be, after China, or rather, we would be the first democracy which will be attempting to fully digitize its governance and its economic activities soon. And we need a new digital constitution for it. And that's not happening. Uh, you need new laws, technically speaking, but the reason I mentioned the digital constitution is the laws of courtrooms really don't work in the cyberspace. You have information laws, you have protocols, and unless your laws essentially recognize these paradigms, right? Like it won't be helpful. Unfortunately, if you happen to notice, every law regarding any technology system in India comes after the technology system is built and not before. And during this entire technology experimentation, the gap between a technology popping up and until it's regulated, you essentially go through its own irregularities, you face difficulties, and you have the government like keeping its own distance whether to regulate it or not. And the primary reason to do that is they want the industry to come up. They really don't want, they see laws are a way to stop this industry, to hurt the industry. And you have the business sector, which is like, no, please don't bring any laws, don't not regulate us, we will self-regulate ourselves, do not interfere, because they are only seeing it as an economic activity. And we must try to understand that this is not an economic activity, it's changing the way we live. And to essentially safeguard ourselves in this new world, we must question things more, as Harsha was pointing out. But at the same time, we need to ask accountability in the cyberspace, and that's not going to come easy. It's very fractured, it has its own rules. Until uh, we are able to articulate it better, I don't think we will be seeing any good future in this, because I'm part of this, rather, I believe in this sci-fi subculture called cyberpunk movement, essentially where corporates are ruling and governments pretty much irrelevant. And we're witnessing that now. It's in fact, the corporates, I mean, I have to take names. It's Mr. Nilekani and his gang in Bangalore who is dictating how Hyderabad should behave in cyberspace, frankly. And I think that should change. Yeah. So on that note, we need a new digital constitution and laws. I hope we will work towards it.
Thank you. Thank you, Srinivas. And thank you, Harsha. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this session. Our next session is Crisis and Amnesia. That will have Tashi Chodap and Saransh Sugandh in conversation with each other about the movement and migration of large numbers, the importance of public sites, and the memorialization and engagement with the exodus and much else. So we hope that we'll join in right away to the next session, and then we'll, after that session, have a break. See you in the next session.